Only 3 people in that diner knew who Chuck Norris was. The waitress didn't. She'd refilled his coffee twice without making the connection, too busy managing a Friday lunch rush to study the face of the quiet man in the corner booth. The cook didn't. He was watching a portable television behind the counter, half following a college football game. The manager didn't. He was on the phone with a supplier. The 3 people who did know were Pete Galvin, Chuck's training partner of 40 years, sitting across the booth, and 2 retired highway patrol officers at the counter who'd recognized him immediately but were too polite to say anything. That was Pasadena, California, October 1992. None of that mattered 30 seconds later when Chuck set down his coffee cup, stood up without a word, and walked out the front door. The story is still told. Nobody filmed it, but Pete Galvin has told it the same way every single time for 30 years, and Pete Galvin is not a man who embellishes.
The old man's name was Walter, 80 years old, 5 feet 6, 140 pounds, the specific thinness of a man whose body has spent decades burning more than it stores. He walked with a slight forward lean that came from 50 years of bricklaying, the permanent posture of someone whose work had bent their spine into the shape of the effort. He wore a brown cardigan. He was carrying 2 grocery bags from the corner market half a block away. He had no idea the 4 men had been watching him since he left the market. The 4 of them had been working the neighborhood in a loose rotation for 3 weeks, long enough to know which blocks the patrol car covered, which stretches of sidewalk had no sight lines from nearby businesses, and which residents moved slow enough that the entire interaction could be over in under a minute. They weren't amateurs. They weren't desperate teenagers. They were 22, 24, 26, and 29 years old respectively, and the oldest one had done this 47 times in 4 cities across 2 states without a single arrest. They operated efficiently. The way it worked, 2 would close from the front, 1 would come in from the side, the 4th held back 10 feet and watched the perimeter. The grocery bags would go first, easier to grab, less resistance than a wallet. The wallet came next. If the target made noise, a single push was usually enough. With an 80-year-old man on a quiet street, they expected under 45 seconds. They did not look across the street at the diner.
Chuck Norris was 52 years old that October. He'd been training in martial arts since 1958, 34 years, 6 consecutive world middleweight karate championships, the most decorated American sport karate career in the discipline's history. By 1992, he was in the 3rd season of Walker, Texas Ranger, a role that required ongoing serious physical preparation rather than the maintenance training that most actors substituted for the real thing. He was also a man who sat facing the door in restaurants, always had. He noticed things that didn't require effort to notice, the way the 4 men on the sidewalk had positioned themselves, the specific angles that didn't match people who were simply standing around. Pete Galvin noticed Chuck's eyes change before Chuck said anything. He went from eating to watching in about half a second, Pete said later. The fork just stopped.
The old man with the grocery bags didn't know he was already surrounded. Pete followed Chuck's gaze through the diner window to the sidewalk across the street, where Walter had slowed his walk without knowing why, the instinctive deceleration of an older person whose body senses something wrong before the mind has caught up. "Chuck," Pete's voice was low. "There's a payphone on the corner." Chuck was already out of the booth. Not fast, not slow. The specific, unhurried efficiency of a man who has already made a decision and is executing it without theater. "Call it in," he said, and he was gone. Pete grabbed for the napkin under his coffee cup, knocked it over, swore, and ran for the payphone. The waitress watched the quiet man from the corner booth walk out without paying and decided to let it go. Something about his face when he'd stood up had made her not want to say anything.
The 4 men had Walter at the edge of the block when Chuck came through the diner door. The 2 who closed from the front had positioned themselves to create the appearance of a conversation, 2 men standing, facing each other, completely blocking the sidewalk in a way that required the approaching pedestrian to stop or step around them. It was the oldest setup available. It worked because it looked like nothing. Walter stopped. He shifted his grocery bags and started to step right around them. The 3rd man came in from the left. His hand found Walter's nearest grocery bag. He pulled. Walter didn't let go. That was the problem. 80 years of doing exactly what needed to be done without flinching. That's not stubbornness, that's character. He held on to his groceries because they were his groceries, and letting go of things that were yours was not something 50 years of bricklaying had taught him. The first man from the front moved in to push. That was when Chuck hit the sidewalk across the street. Think about what those 4 men were looking at. An elderly man with grocery bags. A street they'd worked for 3 weeks. 0 threats. They had every variable accounted for. Every variable except the one that had just crossed the street. Chuck didn't run. He walked fast. The specific controlled pace of someone covering distance without advertising urgency. He'd been across a 4-lane street and a service road. By the time the man's hand found Walter's grocery bag, Chuck had covered maybe 60 feet. The 4th man, the perimeter watcher, was the first to see him coming. He was 29 years old and had done this 47 times. He had a calibrated sense for danger, built from years of reading streets and people and the specific geometry of situations that could go wrong. What he saw coming across the service road triggered that sense in a way he couldn't immediately explain. Not a cop's walk, not a passerby's walk, something else entirely. Something with a different quality of intention embedded in how the feet moved. "Heads up," he said. "Not fast enough."
What happened in the next 22 seconds would be described by Pete Galvan to every serious training student he taught for the following 30 years, always with the same ending. I was still dialing when it was already over. The man whose hand was on Walter's grocery bag turned to look. Chuck was 10 feet away. For 1 second, the specific, unspent second before a situation clarifies itself, the 4 men recalibrated. Not retreat, assessment. The man coming toward them didn't look like police, didn't look like a threat in any conventional category. He was wearing civilian clothes, moving without aggression in his posture, his hands not raised, his face entirely calm. His face was the problem. The perimeter watcher had time to think, this man has done something like this before. The thought arrived, and he didn't know what to do with it. "Walk away," Chuck said. 2 words, no volume. The tone of someone stating a preference, not issuing a command. The man holding Walter's grocery bag made the decision that would define the story. He didn't walk away. He let go of the bag, pivoted, and threw a straight right hand at Chuck's face.
Chuck's left forearm came up, not a full block, a deflection. The punch skimmed past his right cheek. His weight had already shifted outside the line of the attack before the punch was half thrown. 2 seconds. He moved inside the man's extended arm, not to strike, to redirect. His right hand found the man's wrist and turned it, using the man's own committed forward momentum to walk him into a controlled stumble. The man went sideways, off balance, 3 steps he hadn't chosen. 3 seconds. The second man came from the left. Chuck pivoted. The man's rush met a frame that wasn't standing where the rush was aimed. The specific, infuriating quality of a trained fighter's footwork. The way they're always somewhere different from where you sent your body. The man's shoulder hit empty air. Chuck placed a single controlled palm strike against his sternum. Not a knockout blow, a spatial correction. And the man sat down hard on the sidewalk. The perimeter watcher grabbed Walter. His plan was simple. Use the old man as a problem. Create a situation that the approaching person would have to stop and manage. The plan lasted approximately. Quiet. Close. He was already there. The perimeter winding 2 feet from him and let Walter go. Later, he couldn't fully explain why. The eyes was the only thing he could come up with. The eyes were wrong. Like he wasn't deciding anything. Like it was already decided. Chuck took Walter's arm with one hand, stepped him back and to the left, away from the perimeter watcher. The 4 men looked at each other. The first man was still recovering his balance. The second was sitting on the sidewalk. The third, who had been holding the far position during all of it, had not moved. The perimeter watcher had his hand slightly raised. Not in surrender, exactly. More in the way a person holds their hands when they've just understood something. 22 seconds. Chuck had not thrown a single strike intended to cause injury. He stood next to Walter, who was still holding both grocery bags, breathing hard, not shaking. The sound of a police siren, distant, getting closer. Pete had reached the payphone.
The 4 men left before the police arrived. Not running, moving fast, turning the corner onto the side street. the specific practiced dissolution of people who had done this before and knew how to become nothing in a neighborhood quickly. The patrol car reached the corner of Lake and Orange 45 seconds after Pete made the call. Chuck was standing with Walter on the sidewalk, holding one of the grocery bags. Walter had not let go of the other one. The officers took statements. Chuck gave his name. One of the officers, young, 2 years on the force, wrote it down, looked at it, looked up, and said nothing. He finished the statement. Walter was checked at the scene. No injuries. Slight elevation in blood pressure that his own doctor would have expected from a brisk walk, let alone this. When the officers finished with Chuck, he walked back across the street to the diner. Pete was already back at the booth, the spilled coffee cleaned up, a fresh cup waiting. "The food's cold," Pete said. "It's fine," Chuck said. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He ate. Pete watched him for a moment. "You want to talk about it?" Pete said. "No," Chuck said. "Then, how much do I owe you for the coffee?" Pete stared at him. "I knocked it over." "I left without paying. How much?" Pete told him. Chuck put the money on the table. He had not celebrated, had not described what he'd done, had not performed the moment for the other diners, some of whom had seen through the window and were now watching him with expressions that ranged from confusion to awe. He finished his lunch.
The story moved through the circuits the way stories moved before the internet, person to person, specific enough to survive the telephone game distortions that vague stories don't, attached to Pete Galvin's name, which in serious martial arts circles carried enough weight that people listened when he told it. By 1994, it had reached training circles in 3 states. By 1995, a version of it had made it to Japan through a visiting American instructor who trained with Pete's students. The details shifted in the telling. The number of men, the exact location, the specific technique described, but the center of it remained intact. A man ate lunch. He saw something happen across the street. He dealt with it. He went back to his lunch. The 4 men were never publicly connected to what happened that afternoon. The police report listed the attempted robbery as interrupted. No arrests at scene. Walter's name was in the report. Chuck's name was in the report. Nobody called the newspapers. Pete says the only thing Chuck said about it afterward that wasn't practical, the only thing that wasn't "how much do I owe you" or "it's fine," happened 3 blocks from the diner, walking back to the car. Pete had said, "You didn't have to do that." Chuck had said, "Yeah, a beat. That's why you do it." Whether every detail of this story is exactly right, nobody who wasn't there can say, but the people who know Pete Galvin, who have trained with him, who have heard him tell this story, they agree on what the story means. It doesn't matter how much you've trained. It doesn't matter how many championships you have or how famous the name on the credits is. The measure of what you've built is what you do when you set down the coffee cup and walk out the door. Walter got home with his groceries. That's the whole story. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones that never made the evening news, the ones that lived in gyms and dojos and the corners of diners, subscribe. More coming. They're all true in the way that matters.